Um, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this comforting expectation of precision. It's like engineering. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the monitor,
Right, yeah.
and the doctor just, points at the screen and says, there it is. There's the problem.
Exactly, because it is binary. I mean, the bone is either broken or it is not broken. It is just a clean, visible reality.
Exactly. And we love that. Like, we like our problems to be visible and neatly
For
categorized.
sure.
But then you step into the world of education, specifically when you look at neurodevelopment and childhood trauma. And suddenly that x-ray machine is, well, it's completely useless.
Completely useless.
You walk into a third-grade classroom, and you are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, honestly, incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
Because, you cannot x-ray a child's behavior.
Right. You just can't. And that is exactly what we are diving into today. Welcome to today's deep dive, by the way.
Glad to be here for this one.
So we are looking at a stack of clinical guidance on trauma-informed care, and we've got that alongside some program outlines for a massive K-12 mental health initiative rolling out in Georgia right now.
Right, the MentalSpace School Initiative.
Exactly. And, okay, let's unpack this, because if you are a teacher, a parent, a school administrator, or honestly just someone who vividly remembers sitting next to the problem kid in middle school.
Oh, we all remember that kid.
Right. Well, this deep dive is going to completely reframe how you look at the concept of a bad kid. Because what looks like defiance on the surface is, like, almost always something much deeper.
And what's fascinating here is that we're not just talking about psychological theory today. We are looking at the realities of the classroom.
Yeah.
We are talking about how educators can recognize these invisible injuries and, more importantly, how we can actually deploy highly effective modern medical treatments directly into schools to solve the problem.
So let's put ourselves in the shoes of a teacher for a second. Let's look at that classroom reality. Because our sources highlight a massive fundamental disconnect in how we perceive behavior.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine you're teaching a math lesson and suddenly a kid in the back row just flips their desk, screams, and storms out.
Yeah, a massive disruption.
Or maybe it's the opposite, right? A kid who used to love participating suddenly just stares at the wall, totally zoned out, refusing to answer you.
It's just completely shutting down.
Right. And the immediate human reaction from the adult is usually, wow, what a disrespectful kid. So you write up a behavioral referral, you send them to the principal's office, and maybe they get detention or suspended.
Which is the traditional disciplinary model, right?
Yeah.
It is based entirely on the assumption that the child is making a conscious, malicious choice to be disruptive or lazy.
Yeah, that they're doing it on purpose.
Yeah.
But the clinical texts we are looking at are essentially pleading with educators to stop and look through a trauma lens before handing out that detention slip.
They really are.
They argue that words like defiance and disrespect are incredibly often mislabeled.
Well, they are mislabeled because we are judging a surface behavior as a moral failing. We are looking at the desk flip and calling it bad character.
Right.
But we aren't looking underneath to see the biological mechanism that just fired off in that child's brain.
And the sources give us some very specific symptoms to look out for, right? Things that parents and teachers reflexively blame on kids just, acting out.
Exactly, but they aren't choices.
Right. We are talking about a child suddenly having severe sleep problems, unexplained aggression, or regression to younger behaviors, like a 10-year-old suddenly using baby talk.
Or bedwetting.
Yeah, bedwetting.
Yeah.
Mentally checking out during a lesson. Hypervigilance, where a kid is just constantly tense, watching the door, jumping at every sound.
Or suddenly avoiding things they used to love, like the playground.
Yes. So why does that happen?
If we connect this to the bigger picture and break down the mechanism of what is actually happening there, it changes everything. You have to recognize these symptoms not as a discipline issue, but as a nervous system response.
A nervous system response. Okay.
Right. The human brain's primary job, above learning math or being polite, is to keep the organism alive.
It makes sense.
So when a child experiences trauma, whether that is abuse, a car accident, community violence, or severe instability at home, their brain shifts into survival mode. It gets stuck in fight, flight, or freeze.
Wow. So they aren't choosing to be difficult. Their brain is literally hijacking their body.
Precisely. That hypervigilance. That is a nervous system constantly scanning the room for threats because it believes it is in danger.
Okay, what about this sudden aggression?
That is the fight response activating. Maybe a classmate accidentally bumped their chair, and instead of interpreting it as an accident, The traumatized brain interprets it as a physical attack.
Oh, wow. And the kid who is staring blankly at the wall.
That is the freeze or dissociation response. The nervous system is so overwhelmed that it is essentially pulling the plug to protect the brain from crashing.
Okay, I want to use an analogy here because this really clicked for me when I was reading through the clinical data.
Sure, go for it.
Think of the child's nervous system like a hypersensitive car alarm. You know the ones you park your car and the alarm goes off when just like a leaf hits the windshield?
Oh yeah, or a loud truck drives by. It's incredibly annoying.
Exactly. It disrupts the whole neighborhood. But the alarm itself isn't broken. It's actually doing exactly what it was wired to do. It's sounding the siren to prevent a break-in.
Right.
The problem is that its calibration is completely off. It's reacting to a leaf as if it were a brick through the window.
That is a great way to put it.
So when a kid checks out or acts disrespectful in class, if we just give them detention, aren't we essentially just punishing the car alarm for doing its job?
That is exactly what we are doing. We are issuing detentions to a car alarm. We are punishing a biological survival mechanism.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is. And by changing our label from bad kid to traumatized kid, we make a profound systemic shift. We move away from the punitive model and we move toward a therapeutic model.
Right.
We stop looking at the child and asking, what is wrong with you? And we finally start asking, what happened to you? And how is your body trying to protect you right now?
Which completely changes the trajectory of that child's life.
Yeah.
Because if we just label them defiant, they get suspended, they fall behind in reading, they start hating school.
And eventually they drop out.
Right. And we see the statistics on how quickly that pipelines straight into the juvenile justice system. But if we recognize the hypersensitive alarm, we can actually fix the wiring.
Yes. That transition from viewing this as a character flaw to a physiological response is the absolute necessary first step. You cannot heal an injury if you are still punishing the symptom.
Okay, but let's get into the reality of that healing. Because once we establish that these behaviors are physiological, a nervous system protecting itself, the immediate next question is, well, how on earth do you fix a broken nervous system alarm?
Right.
This brings us to the science of the treatments themselves, because our sources state quite emphatically that trauma is highly treatable.
It is incredibly treatable, and that is a message that desperately needs to be amplified because society often treats childhood trauma as a permanent life sentence.
Yeah, like it's just over for them.
Exactly. People assume that once a kid is traumatized, they are just broken forever.
And the clinical texts point to two specific therapeutic methods that have strong, proven evidence for children and adolescents. We have TF-CBT, which stands for Trauma-Focused Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, and EMDR.
Yes, those are the gold standards right
But
now.
here's where it gets really interesting and where I really need to push back a bit, because I read the timeline in the sources, and it sounds almost too good to be true. The data notes that full courses of treatment for these therapies typically take only 12 to 16 sessions. Wait, really? 12 to 16 sessions?
Yep, that is the standard clinical timeline.
I mean, I have a really hard time believing a kid's trauma can be resolved in 3 or 4 months. When most people think of therapy, they think of an adult spending 10 years on a couch talking about their mother.
Right, the classic psychoanalysis image.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How is it possible to see these massive remission rates? The data says we are looking at between 60 and 80% remission for pediatric PTSD in just a dozen sessions.
Yeah.
What are they actually doing in that room?
It is a great question because it challenges our whole pop culture understanding of what therapy is.
Yeah.
You are right to point out that adults can spend years in open-ended talk therapy.
Yeah.
But children's brains are structurally different. They possess an immense amount of neuroplasticity. Their neural pathways are like wet cement. They are actively wiring and rewiring themselves every single day.
So their brains are just inherently more adaptable than an adult whose habits are literally set in stone.
Yeah. Highly adaptable. When trauma treatment like TF-CBT or EMDR starts early, before those maladaptive pathways have decades to solidify into adult personality disorders or chronic depression, the brain is remarkably resilient.
Okay, that makes sense.
And to answer your question about what they're doing, these aren't just sessions where a child complains about their week. These are highly structured, evidence-based medical interventions.
Break down EMDR for me, because that acronym gets thrown around a lot. But what is the actual mechanism there?
EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Without getting too deep into the neuroscience, when a traumatic event happens, the memory often gets stuck in the emotional fight-or-flight center of the brain.
The amygdala, right?
Exactly, the amygdala. It doesn't get processed and stored away like a normal memory, so every time something reminds the child of the event, the brain reacts as if the trauma is happening right now.
So the alarm triggers.
Right. During EMDR, the therapist uses bilateral stimulation, often having the child track the therapist's fingers back and forth with their eyes, while gently focusing on the traumatic memory.
Wait, tracking fingers. What does that eye movement actually do?
It mimics the biological process of REM sleep, which is how our brains naturally process daily information. The bilateral stimulation essentially unsticks the trauma.
Oh.
Yeah, it allows the brain to process the memory and move it out of the active alarm center and into standard long-term storage. The memory doesn't disappear, but it loses its thoughts like, the world is always dangerous, or this was my fault, and it systematically restructures them. And doing this early, in those 12 to 16 sessions, prevents years of compounding behavioral referrals.
Amazing.
That 60 to 80% remission rate for pediatric PTSD is a life-altering statistic. You are literally saving that child's future.
Okay, I am completely sold on the clinical side, the therapies work. But as I was reading this, a massive, glaring logistical hurdle jumped out at me.
I think I know where you're going with this.
We have this highly effective 12 to 16-week treatment. But having the cure doesn't matter if you can't get the medicine to the patient. How do we actually get the kids to the therapist?
Yeah.
Because standard real-world referrals are a nightmare.
Well, the access bottleneck is where the entire mental health system usually collapses.
Right. Think about a working parent. You go to the school counselor because your kid is acting out. The counselor hands you a printed list of phone numbers.
And then you have to make the calls.
Right. You call them. Half of them aren't accepting new patients. The other half have a 6-month wait list. And if you finally find someone, they don't take Medicaid, or the only appointment they have is at 2:00 p.m. on a Tuesday across town.
Which is impossible for most people.
If you are a single mom working 2 hourly shifts, you literally cannot get your kid into that chair.
And while you wait 6 months on a list, the child is still in the classroom, still hypervigilant, still getting suspended. The damage compounds.
Which brings us to the solution. And this is how the state of Georgia is solving this exact access bottleneck through telehealth with the MentalSpace school model.
It is a really innovative approach.
Our sources outline how MentalSpace provides trauma-specialized K-12 mental health support across Georgia's schools. And the crown jewel of this program is same-day teletherapy.
Same day. That is huge.
It really is. They assign dedicated, licensed therapist teams directly to specific schools.
And we really need to emphasize the phrase dedicated therapist teams. This isn't just a school handing a kid an iPad and connecting them to a massive, anonymous, nationwide call center.
Where they talk to a different random person every week.
Exactly. Consistency is key.
Right. The sources stress that these therapists are diverse, culturally competent, and they become a consistent presence. And they have set up a fast-track referral system for students.
Do you have the portal for that?
Yeah, they use a specific portal. The sources mention it is at treesetherapy.com, mental health tests. So when a kid is identified as struggling, they aren't put on a 6-month wait list. They're getting intervention immediately.
It fundamentally changes the dynamic of school-based care.
It feels like they are essentially installing a specialized virtual emergency room right inside the school building.
That's a good way to look at it.
But I want to ask you about the structure of that team. So instead of handing a parent a phone number and hoping they call, schools have same-day telehealth. How does having a dedicated, culturally competent team per school change the dynamic compared to an anonymous hotline?
It changes everything because the foundation of all trauma therapy is trust. If you are a teacher and you have a student having a severe dysregulated episode, flipping a desk, crying inconsolably, calling an anonymous hotline, feels like shouting into the void.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The student doesn't know the voice on the other end. But if you have a dedicated team, a team that knows your school's culture, understands the local community demographics, and who the students actually recognize as their team, the barrier to entry drops.
They become a trusted part of the school community, even if they are engaging virtually.
Precisely. And by ensuring the team is diverse and culturally competent, MentalSpace ensures that the care resonates with the students' actual lived experiences. A one-size-fits-all approach does not work for childhood trauma. But what is arguably even more revolutionary in the MentalSpace outline is that it goes way beyond just treating the student.
Yes. This part blew my mind. The program handles crisis intervention, suicide and violence prevention, but it also explicitly extends to staff wellness and family counseling.
It treats the whole system.
And at first glance, someone might ask, why are we spending resources treating the adults? The kids are the ones acting out. Just fix the kids. Why is that ecosystem support so critical?
Because a child does not exist in a vacuum. Let's go back to our car alarm analogy.
Okay.
If you treat the child for 45 minutes a week and successfully recalibrate their alarm, but then they return to a classroom with a deeply burned out, highly reactive teacher,
Oh, wow, yeah.
or they go home to a family system that is buckling under poverty or domestic stress, I mean, that newly calibrated alarm is just going to get smashed all over again.
You can't heal a plant if the soil it's sitting in is fundamentally toxic. You have to treat the environment.
Exactly. By offering staff wellness and family counseling, MentalSpace is treating the entire ecosystem around the child. If the teacher is regulated, the classroom is calmer.
Right.
If the parents have support, the home is safer. It reinforces the central clinical theme we see across all these sources. Successfully treating trauma requires systemic, community-wide support.
That makes total sense. Okay, so we have this beautiful clinical vision. Dedicated teams, ecosystem support, same-day telehealth, resolving trauma in 16 sessions. It sounds amazing.
It really does.
But let's step into the harsh reality of public education administration. Because if I am a school principal or a district superintendent listening to this, I am immediately thinking about my budget, and I'm thinking about state laws.
Always.
How is this actually funded? Is it legally compliant?
Well,
This is where so many incredible ideas just die on an administrator's desk.
administrative red tape and budget constraints are the graveyard of good educational intentions. But this is where the MentalSpace model actually proves its viability. Yeah, the financials and compliance metrics in this outline are incredibly robust.
Let's start with the money, because therapy is expensive.
Yeah.
But according to the sources, for families on Medicaid, the out-of-pocket cost is exactly $0.
Which removes the single biggest barrier to care for our most vulnerable student populations. Cost is usually the wall that stops everything.
It's huge. And for the families not on Medicaid, they accept almost every major commercial insurance you can think of.
What's the list look like?
The sources list BCBS, Cigna, Aetna, UHC, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, and AmeriGroup. So the financial burden is largely removed from the school district itself.
That's a relief for administrators.
Definitely. But what about the legal side? Schools are terrified of privacy lawsuits.
As they should be. And the MentalSpace service is fully HIPAA and FERPA compliant.
Let's define those quickly for anyone not deep in the admin weeds. HIPAA is the federal law that protects medical privacy, meaning a child's therapy notes are locked down and secure. And FERPA is the educational equivalent. It's the law protecting a student's educational records, grades, and disciplinary history from being shared improperly. MentalSpace handles both.
Correct. They ensure the bridge between medical care and the school environment is legally watertight.
But here is the piece of the program outline that I think is going to make every Georgia school administrator sit up and take notes. The documents explicitly highlight that MentalSpace provides HB 268 compliant support, and they note a very strict deadline of July 2026.
Yes. That is the ticking clock for school leadership in Georgia.
Let's unpack that, because HB 268 is a major legislative mandate in Georgia that essentially requires schools to have specific mental health, safety, and crisis intervention protocols in place.
It's an enormous logistical burden for schools that are already stretched thin.
So what does this all mean? If I'm a superintendent listening to this right now, I'm looking at the July 2026 deadline for HB 268 compliance. Does a plug-and-play solution like MentalSpace act as a lifeline for schools scrambling to meet state mandates while also delivering these massive 89% bumps in attendance?
It acts as an absolute lifeline, yes. Because building a compliant mental health infrastructure from scratch, hiring therapists, building secure telehealth portals, establishing crisis protocols is incredibly expensive and complex for a school district to do on its own.
I can imagine.
MentalSpace brings an already compliant infrastructure right to their doorstep.
And administrators can see exactly how to implement this by reaching out to them directly. The sources give the contact points as mentalspaceschool.com or by emailing mentalspaceschool@cheechtherapy.com.
Nice.
But beyond just checking a legal box for the state by 2026, the tangible outcomes reported here are what truly matter. The data shows an 89% improved attendance rate, a 92% reduction in anxiety, and an 85% family satisfaction rate.
I want to pause on those numbers because that data completely connects the dots between mental health and academic success. Often, school administrators view mental health initiatives as an extra burden, a distraction from their real job, which is teaching, reading, and math.
Yeah, that's a common mindset.
But look at the correlation there. A 92% reduction in anxiety directly correlates to that 89% improvement in attendance.
Because kids with severe, untreated anxiety avoid school. That's the avoidance behavior the trauma techs warned us about earlier.
Exactly.
If your nervous system thinks the school is a place of danger, you'll do anything to stay home.
Spot on. When your brain is stuck in fight or flight, you cannot focus on algebra, and you don't want to walk into the building. When you use a program like MentalSpace to heal the nervous system, the child feels safe enough to return to the classroom. So for an administrator, this isn't just about meeting the HB 268 mandate. It proves that treating the nervous system fundamentally fixes the school problem. You cannot teach a child who isn't physically in the seat, and you cannot teach a child whose brain is actively scanning for predators.
It is a rare, beautiful alignment of clinical best practices, financial realities, and administrative logistics. So let's zoom out and summarize the journey we have been on today for everyone listening.
Sure.
We started by walking into that murky third-grade classroom. We fundamentally reframed what we used to write off as defiance or zoning out. We learned to recognize those behaviors not as a character flaw, but as the trauma response, a car alarm going off to protect a child.
We made the shift from punishing the symptom to treating the underlying injury.
Right, and we discovered that this injury is incredibly treatable. We learned the mechanisms behind therapies like TF-CBT and EMDR, and how just 12 to 16 sessions can yield up to an 80% remission rate in pediatric PTSD.
We are talking about rewiring the alarm system before it becomes a permanent adult struggle.
Exactly. Finally, we explored how the MentalSpace school model in Georgia is tearing down the massive access bottleneck. They're utilizing same-day telehealth, $0 Medicaid options, and comprehensive ecosystem support for teachers and families to bring these life-saving solutions directly into the classroom.
All while helping schools meet urgent state compliance deadlines. It is a profound blueprint for systemic, community-level change.
It really is.
Which leaves us with a very compelling final thought for you to consider.
Oh, let's hear it.
If specialized, targeted treatment can resolve pediatric PTSD for 60 to 80% of children in just 12 to 16 sessions, and if it can be delivered right to their school desk on the same day at no cost to Medicaid families, what would our society look like in a single generation if we entirely replaced the concept of punishing bad behavior with healing the nervous system?
We might just finally fix that broken X-ray machine. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.